Sophia Bennett never imagined she would become the wife of a billionaire. But when life pushed her into a corner, she had no other choice. Her family was drowning in debt. The hospital kept calling with grim updates on her mother's condition. She needed money, an amount she could never earn in a lifetime. Then Alexander Grayson appeared, a ruthless, cold, and powerful CEO. He didn't believe in love, nor did he need a real wife. What he needed was the perfect image to protect his empire from malicious rumors. And Sophia was the perfect candidate. "This marriage is just a contract." Alexander's voice was devoid of emotion. No love, no attachments, just a mutually beneficial arrangement. Sophia knew she was selling her freedom, but as she signed her name on the contract, she had no idea that this very moment would change her life forever. Sophia Bennett and Alexander Grayson's wedding was the epitome of luxury, draped in flashing lights and hollow congratulations. The most powerful figures in the business world attended, eager to witness the perfect union between two complete strangers. Sophia wore a breathtaking wedding gown, her lips curved into a flawless smile. But inside, she felt empty. Alexander stood beside her, the picture of elegance, yet his gaze remained cold and distant. When the ceremony ended, his hand rested lightly on her waist, a gesture that appeared intimate but carried no warmth. When the doors of the Grayson estate closed behind them, sealing them away from the cameras and prying eyes, the air turned suffocatingly cold. No more congratulations, no more forced smiles, just silence. A vast, unspoken distance between two strangers. "Your room is down the hall," Alexander said, removing his jacket and draping it over a chair. "We'll live under the same roof, but I don't expect anything beyond what we agreed upon." Sophia nodded, masking the strange flicker of disappointment in her chest. She had known this from the start. This was just a contract, no feelings, no attachments. But why did her heart feel so heavy? The days that followed were filled with distant encounters and routine formalities. Alexander left for work early in the morning and returned late at night, by which time Sophia had already retreated to her room. They only appeared together when necessary, before the press, at high society events, and during obligatory dinners. Every time they stepped out in public, Alexander played the role of the devoted husband flawlessly, his arm around her waist, whispers of sweet nothings into her ear that both knew were devoid of meaning. But the moment they stepped back into their mansion, they reverted to strangers, each lost in their own world. Despite knowing this marriage was nothing but an arrangement, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. Every night she lay in a bed that didn't feel like hers, listening to the distant sound of Alexander's footsteps echoing down the hall. He never entered her room, never made an effort to bridge the gap between them. She reminded herself not to expect anything. And yet, with each passing day, Sophia couldn't ignore one undeniable truth. No matter how cold Alexander Grayson was, his mere presence still made her heart race. Sophia didn't know exactly when things began to shift. Maybe it was the lingering glances, the accidental brushes of skin, or perhaps it was the strange awareness she felt whenever Alexander was near. At first, she tried to ignore it. She reminded herself that this was just a contract, that Alexander was not a man capable of love. But no matter how much she tried, she couldn't overlook the subtle moments that were slowly changing the atmosphere between them. One evening, after a long and exhausting day at the hospital with her mother, Sophia returned home with a heavy heart. She sank onto the living room couch, staring blankly at the flickering flames in the fireplace. She hadn't even heard the footsteps behind her until a deep, familiar voice broke the silence. "You're still awake?" She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, the top buttons of his shirt undone. He looked different. Not the cold, untouchable CEO the world knew, but a man who, for once, seemed softer. She pressed her lips together and shook her head. "I couldn't sleep." Instead of heading to his office like he usually did, Alexander poured himself a drink and, surprisingly, sat beside her. "How was your day?" Sophia sighed, her gaze still fixed on the fire. "My mother, she's not doing well. The doctors aren't sure how much longer she has." Her voice wavered despite her efforts to stay composed. Alexander didn't respond immediately. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy, filled with something unspoken. And then, in a voice that was firm, unwavering, he said, "She'll get the best care. You don't have to worry about that." Sophia inhaled shakily. "Thank you." She hadn't expected comfort from him, and Alexander was not the type to offer it, but in that moment, as she truly looked at him, she saw something different. Something unfamiliar, flickering in his sharp blue eyes. She reminded herself that it didn't mean anything, that this was still just a contract. But the intensity in his gaze told a different story. It lingered, a silent question she wasn't ready to answer, and even as she told herself to look away, her pulse betrayed her, quickening under his unrelenting stare. And in that moment, Sophia realized something between them had begun to change. It wasn't just the way his fingers lingered on her skin a second too long. It wasn't just the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. It was something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. The air between them was no longer cold indifference. It was charged with something dangerous, something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. The rainstorm that night mirrored the storm raging inside Sophia, a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't control. She had spent the entire day at the hospital, watching her once strong mother grow weaker under the weight of her illness. She felt helpless, exhausted, as if the world was closing in on her. When she returned home, Sophia didn't go straight to her room. Instead, she collapsed onto the living room couch, staring blankly at the flickering flames in the fireplace. She didn't realize Alexander was there until his deep voice broke the silence. "Are you okay?" She startled, glancing up at him. Alexander wasn't dressed in his usual pristine suit. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled, the top buttons undone, revealing the tanned skin of his collarbone. For the first time, he didn't look like an untouchable CEO. He looked like a man. She took a shaky breath. "My mother. The doctors said she might not make it." Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped forward and sat beside her, closer than ever before. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said, his voice steady, certain. Sophia let out a hollow laugh. "Do I have a choice?" Something flickered in Alexander's sharp blue eyes. Anger? Frustration? Or something deeper, something he couldn't name? "I'm here, Sophia," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. She looked at him, her emerald eyes shimmering with unshed tears. There was something in the way he said those words that made her chest tighten. And then, before she could process it, Alexander reached out, his fingers tilting her chin up. His gaze burned into hers, dark and unreadable. "If I kiss you right now," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "will you push me away?" Sophia didn't answer. She couldn't. And that was all the permission Alexander needed. His lips crashed against hers, hot, demanding, filled with a hunger neither of them had acknowledged until now. Sophia stiffened for a second, but then, like a moth drawn to flame, she melted into him. Her fingers clenched the fabric of his shirt as he pulled her closer, his mouth exploring hers with unrestrained intensity. This kiss wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was possession, a declaration. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his breath hot against her lips. "This isn't just a contract anymore, Sophia," he whispered. And in that moment she knew everything had changed forever. After that night, nothing between Sophia and Alexander was the same. The next morning she woke up half convinced that it had all been a dream. But when she stepped out of her room, she found Alexander sitting in the kitchen, one hand holding a cup of coffee, the other flipping through a newspaper as if nothing had changed. It wasn't until she walked past him that he spoke. "You forgot something." Sophia stopped, turning to him with a frown. "What?" Alexander folded his newspaper, placed his coffee down, and looked at her with that same piercing blue gaze, one that now held something new, something unreadable. Then, with an unsettling calm, he reached out, his fingertip grazing her chin. "I didn't get my good morning kiss." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could utter a single word, Alexander leaned in, pressing a slow, possessive kiss against her lips. This wasn't like the reckless, desperate kiss from the night before. This was a statement. And it wasn't the last. The next morning, and every morning after that, Alexander continued this ritual as if it were an unbreakable habit. Sometimes it was a brief, teasing brush of lips. Other times it was deeper, lingering, stealing the breath from her lungs. And each time, Sophia felt herself losing more control. But it didn't stop there. His touches became more frequent. If she was reading on the couch, he would settle beside her, one arm draped over her shoulder, his fingers tracing lazy circles against her skin. If she was cooking, he would stand behind her, his breath warm against her neck as he murmured something entirely unnecessary. And the worst part was at night. Though she still slept in her own room, she often woke in the middle of the night with the inexplicable feeling that she wasn't alone. Sometimes it was the sound of his footsteps outside her door. Sometimes it was the faint creak of the door opening. And sometimes it was the warmth of him near, though she never dared open her eyes to confirm. Sophia knew she should keep her distance. But each time Alexander pulled her into his arms, each time his gaze burned into hers, she wasn't sure how much longer she could resist. Because with every passing day, he was slowly dismantling every wall she had built. Sophia had never seen Alexander lose control. He was always the composed one, the man who calculated everything with ruthless precision. But tonight, as she woke up in a hospital bed with his hand gripping hers tightly, his gaze wild with fear and anger, she knew something had changed. "How could you be so reckless?" His voice was hoarse, laced with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Sophia blinked, trying to piece together what had happened. She remembered the blaring sound of a car horn, the blinding headlights, and the brief moment when someone had pulled her back before darkness consumed her. I wasn't paying attention," she whispered. Alexander clenched his jaw, his blue eyes darkening. "Do you have any idea what went through my mind when I saw you lying on that street?" His voice cracked, something she had never heard before. His grip on her hand tightened, as if he was afraid she might slip away again. "I thought I had lost you, Sophia, and for the first time in my life, I realized there is something I can't afford to lose." She didn't answer because the truth was, she didn't know. But she saw the answer in his eyes, the fear, the panic, and the emotion she had spent so long convincing herself didn't exist between them. He didn't say another word. His grip on her hand tightened, as if afraid she would vanish if he let go. Then he leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, not like the ones before. This one trembled with something raw, something desperate. It tasted of fear, of regret, of the terrifying realization that he could have lost her. And when he pulled back, his voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "This was never just a contract for me." And Sophia knew, no matter how many times she had tried to deny it, she could no longer lie to herself. Sophia stood by the bedroom window, gazing at the city lights. The night was calm, but her heart was anything but. Alexander's words still echoed in her mind. This was never just a contract for me. She had tried to deny it, tried to keep her distance, but how could she lie to herself any longer? She felt his presence before he even touched her, a warm breath against her neck, then strong arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" His deep voice rumbled through her. Sophia placed her hand over his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You? Us." Alexander turned her to face him. His piercing blue eyes no longer held their usual coldness. Instead, they were filled with something raw, something real. "I love you, Sophia," he murmured, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "No contracts, just us." She looked into his eyes, her heart pounding, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She rose onto her toes, pressing her lips against his, a kiss of acceptance, of love, of certainty. When they finally parted, Alexander chuckled softly, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm still going to ask for my morning kiss every day." Sophia laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "And this time, I'll always be ready." Sophia stood on the balcony of their villa, the gentle breeze playing with her soft curls. The night air was crisp, but the warmth behind her was unmistakable. The warmth of the man who had once been untouchable, yet now refused to let her go. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, dotted with a million twinkling stars. But the warmest light still came from the man stepping up behind her. Alexander wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about, my love?" His voice was deep, familiar, yet it still sent a shiver down her spine. She smiled, placing her hands over his. "Just that. A year ago, I never imagined we'd be here." Alexander turned her to face him, his piercing blue eyes now filled with something softer, something real. "Neither did I. But I know one thing." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers as he whispered, "I never stopped wanting you." Sophia laughed softly, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Then you can want me forever. How about that?" Alexander didn't answer with words. Instead, he kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss, one filled with everything they had been through. When they pulled apart, he smirked. "Morning, night. I'll always ask for my kiss." Sophia stood on her toes, pressing a feather-light kiss to the corner of his lips. "And this time, I'll always be the one to kiss you first." Under the endless stars, they laughed together, knowing their love was no longer bound by a contract, but by forever. Thank you for watching until the end. If you were captivated by the emotional love story of Sophia and Alexander, leave a comment with the word "kiss" to show that you felt the passion and intensity in every kiss they shared. And don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss more romantic stories like this. Love sometimes starts with a contract, but who knows? Maybe a single kiss can change everything?